Nathaniel Gray woke up in a sterile hospital room. His eyes slowly fluttered open, adjusting to the bright overhead lights. A dull ache throbbed at his temples, and his vision was blurry at first, forcing him to blink several times before things began to focus. The air around him was cool, and the scent of antiseptic lingered faintly. But the most overwhelming feeling was confusion, profound, unshakable confusion. He tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness hit him like a tidal wave, forcing him to fall back onto the hospital bed. His body felt heavy, as though it wasn't entirely his own, and a strange sense of unease spread through him. What had happened to him? Why was he here? Why did it feel like his very life was shrouded in darkness? He tried to think back, to reach into his mind for any fragments of memory, but it was as though there was a wall in his brain, blocking him from recalling anything before the moment he woke up in this room. His thoughts were scattered, fragmented, lost in a haze of unfamiliarity. His past was completely erased, and the only thing that existed was the present moment and this oppressive emptiness that surrounded him. Who was he? The question lingered like an echo in his mind, growing louder and more insistent with every passing second. His chest tightened with a strange panic as he realized he didn't know anything. Not his name, not who he was, not how he got here, nothing. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps reached his ears. A woman entered the room, her soft footsteps interrupting the eerie silence. Nathaniel turned his head toward her, squinting slightly as his vision slowly cleared. She was beautiful, with long dark hair cascading down her shoulders and eyes that held a depth of emotion, a mixture of concern, familiarity, and something else that Nathaniel couldn't quite place. She smiled gently at him, though there was a flicker of worry in her eyes. "How are you feeling?" Her voice was soft, yet it carried an undeniable tenderness, as though she had been waiting for him to wake up for a long time. Nathaniel stared at her, his mind racing, but nothing about her seemed familiar. He wanted to remember, to place her in his mind, but there was only emptiness. "Who are you?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but the question felt urgent. The woman's smile faltered, and for a brief moment, she looked as though she didn't know how to respond. But then, she regained her composure and took a step closer to the bed. "I'm Isabel," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Is there anything I can get you? Anything at all?" Nathaniel's brow furrowed, the name unfamiliar on his lips. "Isabel?" he repeated, as if saying her name would unlock something in his memory. But nothing came. No rush of recognition, no spark of recollection, just a void. She seemed to notice his confusion, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she sat down beside him, her expression gentle, though there was a sadness in her eyes that Nathaniel couldn't quite understand. "You don't remember me, do you?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with a sadness that seemed to echo in the room. I don't remember anything," Nathaniel replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, trying to read her expression, but all he could see was a woman he didn't recognize, and yet there was something about her that felt deeply familiar, like a part of him he couldn't reach. "I don't even know who I am." Isabel's face softened with sympathy. She gently placed a hand on his, her touch warm and reassuring. "It's okay," she said, her voice calming. "You've been through a lot. You've been in a coma for weeks. I'm just glad you're awake now." Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. A coma? Weeks? He tried to process her words, but they didn't make sense. He couldn't remember anything about his life before this moment. How could he have been unconscious for so long and not remember a thing? His mind raced, searching for any clue, any detail that could help him understand what had happened. But there was nothing. "Coma?" Nathaniel asked, his voice barely audible. "Why can't I remember anything?" Isabel sighed, looking down at her hands for a moment before she met his gaze again. "You were in an accident. A car crash. You were in a really bad condition when they brought you in. The doctors didn't think you'd make it, but here you are." She smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes that made Nathaniel feel like there was more she wasn't saying. "A car crash?" Nathaniel repeated, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. He tried to picture Itrid, to recall anything about it, but the more he tried, the more the memories slipped away. It was like trying to hold water in his hands, only to watch it drain away, leaving nothing behind but confusion. "I'm sorry," Isabel said softly, her voice filled with a tenderness that made Nathaniel's chest tighten. "I know it's hard, but I'll help you remember. You don't have to do this alone." Nathaniel closed his eyes, trying to process everything. He didn't understand how he could have been in a coma for so long and lost all his memories. He didn't understand how Isabel was here, why she was here. The only thing he knew for sure was that he felt a strange pull toward her, a connection that defied logic. Even though he didn't remember her, he felt like she was someone important to him. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking with frustration. "Why can't I remember anything? Why can't I remember you?" Isabel's face softened, her expression filled with an emotion that Nathaniel couldn't place. She squeezed his hand gently. "You will," she said, her voice steady. "It's just gonna take time. You've been through a lot and your brain needs time to heal. But I'll be here for you, I promise." Nathaniel looked at her, a part of him wanting to believe her, to trust that things would return to normal. But another part of him was afraid that he might never remember anything. Afraid that he would never understand what had happened to him or why Isabel was so important. Days passed, and Isabel remained a constant presence in Nathaniel's life. She visited him every day, bringing him food, helping him with simple tasks, and talking to him about their life together, about the things they had done, the memories they had shared. She seemed to know everything about him, even though he couldn't remember anything. Her stories were filled with details of their life together, but each one felt distant, like a tale from a life that belonged to someone else. Nathaniel listened intently, trying to piece together the fragments of his past, but it was like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. No matter how much Isabel told him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was more to his past than she was letting on. One afternoon, as the sunlight filtered through the window, Isabel sat beside him, holding a small photo in her hand. She handed it to Nathaniel, and he stared at it, his heart racing. It was a picture of a man and a woman standing together, smiling in front of a small house. The man in the photo looked strikingly like Jaime, except younger, more alive. He was smiling brightly, dressed casually, with his arm around Isabel's shoulder. Isabel looked at the camera with a loving expression, her hand resting on his chest. "This is us," Isabel said softly. "This was before the accident. This is your life, Nathaniel. This was the life you had before." Nathaniel stared at the photo, his mind reeling. He couldn't connect to it. The man in the photo was him, but it didn't feel like it. The smiles, the joy of it felt like something he had experienced. He felt a deep ache in his chest, a yearning for something he couldn't reach. "I don't remember," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't remember any of this." Isabel didn't say anything for a moment. She just sat there, watching him, her expression unreadable. Then she reached out and took his hand, her fingers brushing against his skin with a tenderness that sent a shiver down his spine. "I know," she said softly. "I know it's hard, but you will remember, I promise. You just have to give it time." Nathaniel closed his eyes, trying to hold on to the promise, but the doubt gnawed at him. What if he never remembered? What if the life he had was gone forever, erased by the accident, leaving nothing but this empty shell of a man who couldn't even recognize the woman sitting beside him? He didn't know the answers. He didn't even know who he was anymore. But one thing was clear: he had to find out. The truth was out there, hidden in the fog of his mind, and he needed to uncover it. Days blurred into weeks. Nathaniel's life had become a constant cycle of waking up, trying to remember, and listening to Isabel's stories of their life together, of the love they once shared. It felt like he was trapped in a dream he couldn't wake up from, a world where everything was familiar but nothing made sense. Isabel was always there, her presence a constant reassurance, yet it only deepened the unease in Nathaniel's chest. There was an unspoken tension between them, a gap that neither of them could bridge, no matter how hard they tried. The doctors had told Isabel that his memory would eventually return, that it was just a matter of time. But with every passing day, Nathaniel felt more and more disconnected from the life she described. The memories she painted for him, memories of vacations, quiet evenings at home, laughter-filled nights with friends felt like fragments of someone else's life. How could he have lived all of that, and yet feel so completely alien to it? Isabel's patience never wavered. She continued to visit him every day, spending hours talking to him, sharing more and more about their past. But Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't telling him. She was so kind, so attentive, so reassuring, but her eyes, the way they would momentarily flicker with something unreadable when he asked certain questions, made him uneasy. It was as if there was something deeper beneath the surface, something she was keeping from him. He wanted to trust her, but how could he when he couldn't remember his own life? One evening, after another long conversation about their life together, Isabel kissed him gently on the forehead and left for the night. Nathaniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The more he tried to remember, the more distant everything became. It was as though the harder he searched for answers, the more elusive they became. That night, something in him snapped. He couldn't keep living in this limbo, accepting the version of his life Isabel presented without questioning it. There were too many gaps, too many contradictions. If he was going to find out who he really was, he needed to take control. He had to start searching for the truth himself. The next morning, Nathaniel feigned sleep when Isabel came in. He listened carefully to the sound of her footsteps as she approached the bed, and once he was sure she had left the room, he pushed himself up with difficulty, using the bed frame for support. His body felt weak and sluggish from the time he had spent in the hospital, but his determination was stronger than the physical pain. He had to leave the room, to explore the hospital, to find anything that might give him a clue about his life before the accident. He stumbled through the hallways, disoriented but driven by a sense of urgency. The sterile white walls of the hospital seemed endless, like a labyrinth he had to navigate to find a way out. His heart was pounding in his chest as he approached the nurse's station, trying to gather his thoughts. He had no idea what he was looking for, only that something wasn't right. The nurse at the station looked up when she saw him. "Mr. Gray, you shouldn't be out of bed," she said, her voice concerned but firm. "You're not fully recovered yet." "I'm fine," Nathaniel said, trying to sound convincing. "I just need to know something. Can you tell me what happened to me? Why am I here? Why don't I remember anything?" The nurse hesitated for a moment, her expression softening. She glanced around as if checking for anyone who might overhear. "I'm not sure if I can share everything with you," she said quietly, lowering her voice. "But I can tell you that your case is complicated. You were in a severe car accident. Your injuries were extensive, and you were unconscious for weeks. But your memory loss is unusual. It's not like typical amnesia." Nathaniel's pulse quickened. "What do you mean unusual?" The nurse hesitated again, looking torn between professional duty and some unspoken urge to help him. "I'm not supposed to say anything, but there's been some speculation. The doctors think that the trauma you experienced might have caused a deeper psychological reaction. It's possible that your memories are blocked, not just because of the accident, but because of something else. Something your mind is keeping from you." Nathaniel stared at her, his mind racing. "Something my mind is keeping from me?" The nurse nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and concern. "I can't tell you more. I'm sorry. You should speak to your doctor about this." Before Nathaniel could respond, the nurse turned away, and he was left standing in the hallway, his mind spinning with her cryptic words. Something else. His mind was keeping something from him. What could it be? What was he hiding from himself? He needed answers, and he needed them fast. His desperation grew as the walls of the hospital seemed to close in on him. He needed to find out what had happened before the accident, and why his memories were being blocked. And, most importantly, he needed to understand his connection with Isabel, because he knew, deep down, that there was more to their relationship than she was letting on. As Nathaniel made his way back to his room, he found Isabel waiting for him, her face filled with concern. "Nathaniel, where did you go?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with worry. "You're supposed to be resting." He met her gaze, a surge of determination flooding through him. He wasn't going to stay in the dark any longer. He wasn't going to let his life be defined by the gaps in his memory. He needed to know the truth, and he was going to find it, no matter what it took. "I need to know everything," Nathaniel said quietly, his voice steady but filled with an intensity that made Isabel pause. "Everything about the accident, about my life. I need to know why I don't remember anything." Isabel's expression faltered for a split second in almost imperceptible hesitation. Then she nodded, though her face remained conflicted. "I understand," she said softly. "But you have to understand, Nathaniel. Some things are better left forgotten." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "I don't think I can forget, not until I know what really happened." Isabel hesitated, as if debating whether to continue, but then she gave a small nod. "All right, I'll tell you everything, but you need to be prepared. The truth might be harder to handle than you think." Nathaniel's heart raced as he followed her back to his bed. He didn't know what she was about to tell him, but he knew that whatever it would change everything. His memories, his life, and the bond he had with Isabel. Isabel took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice trembling slightly, as she started to unravel the truth about the accident, about their past, and about the dark secrets they had both buried. Nathaniel sat silently as Isabel began to speak, her words carefully measured but laced with an undeniable sadness. The air between them felt thick, charged with a tension neither of them could ignore. He had asked for the truth, but now that it was unfolding before him, he wasn't sure he was ready for what he might hear. "You don't remember the details, Nathaniel," Isabel said, her voice trembling slightly, "and I never wanted you to, but I owe it to you now to tell you everything. The truth is, our lives weren't as perfect as you might have imagined." She paused as if searching for the right words, her fingers nervously twisting in her lap. "Before the accident, before everything happened, we were in a bad place." Nathaniel's heart began to race. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. A bad place? He tried to imagine what could have led them there. His heart, despite the fear growing inside of him, also held a faint, desperate hope that perhaps there was something to cling to, something that would explain the void in his mind, that would allow him to piece together the fragments of his fractured memories. "What do you mean by a bad place?" Nathaniel asked, his voice low but filled with determination. He needed to know. Isabel's gaze faltered. She bit her lip before continuing, her eyes locked on the floor as though it was easier to face the past when she wasn't looking at him. "We were fighting," she said softly. "We argued all the time, Nathaniel, about everything, about your job, about our future, about our families. We were drifting apart, and I didn't know how to fix it. I thought I could change things, but it just kept getting worse." Isabel looked up at him now, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. But then the accident happened. Nathaniel sat frozen, absorbing her words, his mind racing. The idea that their once idyllic relationship could have been fractured by constant conflict felt like a betrayal. How could he have been so blind to it? Or perhaps it wasn't him who had been blind, it was his memory, the person he used to be. What had he been like before the accident? He needed to know. He needed to understand who he was before. "I don't remember any of that," he admitted, his voice tight with frustration. "I don't remember the arguments or what we were going through. All I have are these fragment pieces of a life I can't hold on to. And now you're telling me things were falling apart?" Isabel wiped her eyes quickly, her expression full of sorrow. "I never wanted you to remember that part, Nathaniel. I never wanted you to know how bad things had gotten. But when you woke up, I knew it was only a matter of time before you started asking questions." Nathaniel's mind spun. This wasn't the love story he had imagined for himself. This wasn't the picture of a perfect, happily ever after life. Could he really accept this version of their past? Could he forgive himself for the man he had been, the man who had let things fall apart? "I don't even know who I was back then," Nathaniel whispered. "What if I don't like who I was? What if I can't even recognize myself in that person?" Isabel's gaze softened, and she reached out to touch his hand gently. "You're not that person anymore. The person you were before the accident's not who you are now. You've changed, Nathaniel. I know it's hard, but you have a chance now to be different, to be better." Nathaniel's chest tightened as the words sank in. She was right in a way. If the old him had been someone he no longer recognized, then maybe he had a chance to rebuild himself, to forge a new path. But it still didn't explain everything. There were still so many unanswered questions. If their relationship had been so broken, why had she stayed with him after the accident? Why hadn't she left? "Why did you stay with me, Isabel?" Nathaniel asked quietly, the question weighing on him. "If everything was falling apart, why didn't you leave?" Isabel hesitated, her gaze flickering with hesitation. "Because I still loved you," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "And because, in a way, I thought that maybe the accident would give us a chance to start over. I thought that maybe, without all the baggage of our past, we could rebuild." Nathaniel felt the air leave his lungs. It didn't make sense. Could love really erase the past? Could a single moment of trauma of near death be enough to reset everything? Was that really what she thought had happened? That he could simply forget everything and come back as someone new? "I wish it was that easy," Nathaniel muttered, more to himself than to Isabel. "But I can't just forget." Isabel's face twisted with a pained expression. "You don't have to forget, Nathaniel, but you do have to let go. You need to forgive yourself, the man you were before, the man who let everything slip away. He doesn't exist anymore. You can start fresh, but only if you let go of the past." For the first time, Nathaniel felt a sliver of something akin to hope. Maybe Isabel wasn't trying to erase the past, maybe she was trying to help him heal, to rebuild the parts of him he had lost. But even as that flicker of hope took root, doubt lingered in the back of his mind. What had really happened in that accident? What had caused him to lose his memories entirely? And why did he feel so strongly that there was more to the story than Isabel had told him? His questions burned in his mind, but there was no way to escape them. The more he learned, the more questions arose. And the more he questioned, the more his desire for the truth grew. As Isabel continued to explain, Nathaniel's eyes caught a glimmer of something on the dresser. His personal items had been brought to the hospital. Among them, he spotted a small leather-bound journal, one he didn't recognize but immediately felt drawn to. He reached for it, and Isabel's expression shifted slightly as she watched him pick it up. "That journal, is it mine?" he asked, holding it carefully. Isabel hesitated before nodding slowly. "Yes, it's yours. You used to write in it every day. It helped you cope with everything, the stress, the frustration of your job, the arguments we had. I thought it might help you now." Nathaniel opened the journal, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the pages. The handwriting was his, recognized it instantly, but the words felt distant, almost foreign. As he read through the entries, his heart sank. The pages were filled with thoughts of frustration, anger, and doubts about his job, about Isabel, about his life. He had been angry. He had been lost. It was no wonder everything had fallen apart. But buried among the chaos were moments of tenderness, glimpses of the man he once was before everything had started to unravel. Small, intimate details about their life together. There were entries about how much he loved her, how deeply he felt for her, but they were overshadowed by the darker thoughts of resentment, dissatisfaction, and loneliness. Nathaniel closed the journal with a heavy sigh. It was clear that he had been at war with himself. And now, as he sat there in the hospital bed, trying to put the pieces of his life back together, he couldn't help but wonder, could he really rebuild it? Could he rebuild himself? "Isabel," he said quietly, his voice filled with the weight of everything he had just discovered. "I don't know if I can go back to being the man I was before. I don't know if I can ever forget what I've read or how broken I was." Isabel looked at him, her eyes filled with compassion. "You don't have to go back, Nathaniel. You don't have to be that man anymore. You can start anew, but you have to decide, truly decide, to let go of the past. As the words sank in, Nathaniel felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. A sliver of resolve, a quiet understanding. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't undo what had been done. But maybe, just maybe, he could build something better for himself. A future he could be proud of. And that, for the first time, felt like enough. Fog in his mind had begun to lift, but there were still fragments of memories, of feelings, and of questions that refused to be answered. Isabel had been patient, guiding him through his recovery, helping him piece together what he could of his former life. But deep down, Nathaniel knew he needed to go further. There were still too many gaps. The journal was still sitting on his bedside table, its pages heavy with the weight of a past he couldn't fully remember. He opened it again, scanning the words he had read the previous night. It was clear that, despite all the anger and frustration, he had loved Isabel. But there was more, something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. The journal hinted at a secret, something Nathaniel had buried deep in his subconscious, something he had chosen not to remember. He had to know what it was. As he sat on the edge of his bed, Isabel entered the room, her face soft with concern. She had been spending less time with him recently, as though she were giving him space, but Nathaniel could sense that she was struggling too. The tension between them was palpably an undercurrent that neither of them could ignore. She wanted to help him, but she had her own burdens, her own secrets. "Good morning," Isabel said quietly, though there was a nervous edge to her voice. "How are you feeling today?" "I'm okay," Nathaniel replied, his eyes meeting hers. "But I need to talk to you. About everything." Isabel's expression faltered. She had been avoiding deep conversations, and Nathaniel could tell she was bracing herself, but he had reached a point where he couldn't stay silent any longer. He needed answers. "Isabel," he began, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "There's something I'm missing. Something in my past. I need to know what happened, the truth. The whole truth." Isabel's face turned pale. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but no words came out. For a moment, she seemed frozen, caught between the man she had known and the man who was now before her. Nathaniel could see the internal battle raging within her. He could feel her hesitation, her fear. Whatever she was about to say, it would change everything. "I don't know if you're ready to hear it," Isabel finally whispered, her voice trembling. "I've been trying to protect you, Nathaniel, trying to shield you from the truth. But I can't do that anymore." Nathaniel's heart hammered in his chest. He wasn't sure what he expected, but the fear in Isabel's eyes told him that whatever it was going to be something he wasn't prepared for. "Please," he said softly, "I need to know." Isabel took a deep breath, gathering her courage. She sat down beside him on the bed, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "You were having an affair," she said quietly. "Before the accident." Nathaniel's mind reeled. The words hit him like a physical blow. An affair? He couldn't process what she was saying. It didn't make sense. Was she telling him that the life they had shared, the love they had built, had been a lie? "I don't remember that," Nathaniel said, his voice strained. "I don't remember doing that to you." Isabel looked down, her eyes filled with sorrow and regret. "You didn't remember, Nathaniel, but I did. I knew, and I stayed because I loved you. I thought we could move past it. I thought you'd change." Nathaniel felt a cold wave wash over him. His thoughts scattered, and he struggled to piece together the fragments of his past, but nothing made sense. The anger he had felt toward his job, toward Isabel, toward himself had all been tied to something he hadn't even been aware of. The betrayal, the guilt, the deep hidden shame. Isabel continued, her voice barely a whisper. "You had been distant for months before the accident. We had grown apart and I couldn't get through to you. And then you made a choice that broke us. You started seeing someone else. And when I found out, I was devastated." Nathaniel's chest tightened. He couldn't comprehend what she was saying. He had hurt her. He had betrayed her in the worst way. The person he had been before the accident that had been a stranger to him. A person he never wanted to be again. And then the accident happened. Isabel continued, her voice trembling with the weight of her own pain. You nearly died. And when you woke up, I thought I had a chance to help you heal. To help us both heal. But I've been lying to you, Nathaniel. I've been keeping this secret because I didn't know how to face it, how to face you. Tears welled in Isabel's eyes, and Nathaniel could see the toll it had taken on her. The years of pretending, of holding everything together while carrying the weight of a shattered heart. She had stayed with him after everything, after the betrayal, because she still loved him. But the guilt, the pain of it all had been eating her from the inside. I couldn't let you remember, Isabel whispered. Because I was afraid you would leave. I was afraid you would walk away from me, from us, once you realized what you had done. Nathaniel's mind was in chaos. He had been living in a haze, a false reality created by the accident. He had no memory of the affair, no memory of the man he had been. But Isabel's words filled the gaps, and with each one, the weight of his past grew heavier. The anger he had felt, the restlessness, the distance everything had been because of his own guilt. His own mistakes. I don't know how to forgive myself, Nathaniel said, his voice breaking. How can I? How can I ever forgive myself for hurting you like that? Isabel took his hand in hers, her grip strong despite her tears. I'm not asking you to forgive yourself right away, Nathaniel. I'm not asking for anything. But you have to understand that we can't change the past. We can't undo what happened, but we can choose what we do next. Nathaniel looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he had just learned. He had been given a second chance at life, at love. But would he be able to rebuild the life he had lost? Could he move forward and leave the guilt behind? Or would it continue to haunt him, shaping his every decision? He didn't know. He didn't have all the answers. But as he looked into Isabel's eyes, he realized that he wasn't alone. She had stayed by his side through the darkness. And perhaps she could find a way to do the same for her. With a deep breath, Nathaniel spoke, his voice steady but full of uncertainty. I don't know if I can fix everything, Isabel, but I want to try. I want to try for us. Isabel's eyes softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled a small, fragile smile, but one that held the promise of something new. And so, Nathaniel began the long road to recovery, not just from the physical trauma of the accident, but from the emotional scars he had inflicted on those he loved. The journey ahead would be difficult, filled with moments of doubt and regret. But for the first time in a long time, he felt the hope of a future where he could rebuild, where he could forgive himself and maybe even begin to love again.